Recently there was an update that added a new deck to the game and now it's 2022, so I decided to rank all of the perk decks. Since there are 22 decks in the game now, I will explain stuff very briefly because it would turn into an hour-long video otherwise. First, I want to explain some stuff. There will be two tier lists. I think it's important to differentiate how good a perk deck is when it's being used by someone who is new and when it's used by someone who's rather experienced at the game. This will make it more interesting, and after spending quite a while on the sentence with almost all of the decks, I think I'm rather qualified to talk about this. I also don't mean to offend any new player in this video, even though it might sound like it. It's just hard to word stuff when comparing two different levels of gameplay. And the last thing, we are talking about loud gameplay here. Stealth tier lists are kinda pointless because they're always the same. Very often, people think this perk is extremely bad, simply because it's kinda the default deck of the game. They also think that the boosts Crew Chief gives are insignificant on the sentence, and this is where they are very wrong. The buffs give lots of different breakpoints and make decks like Stoic, Kingpin, Muscle or Anarchist very crazy. Unfortunately for the boosts to apply, there's some hostage management required, and newer players might not be aware of how this works. Crew Chief is overall very tanky and has a 2-shot ICTV on the sentence by default. Another thing is that it requires you to be pretty passive at times, and that's something newer players will most likely not understand, so for beginner level, the deck goes down to C tier. If you are capable of playing slower decks well, and know how to optimally support your team with Crew Chief, then A tier is a reasonable rank. Remember that this deck was buffed a while ago because apparently it was not good enough for Death Wish? No idea why Muscle specifically, when it was better than at least half the decks in the game even before the buff, but I guess I was just playing a different game. You have very good health regeneration, pretty crazy number of health points, and an additional panic mechanic. It's a pretty plain deck, but it's also very effective at the same time. It's also rather slow, just like Crew Chief, which means newer players won't have a great time with it. Overall, it's surely a better deck than Crew Chief if you exclude the teamwork aspects, but it's not leagues ahead. C+ tier for newer players and A+ tier for more experienced ones. What an amazing deck Armor is. It's so good, yet it's so easy to find rant posts with people yelling it's weak and needs to be buffed for Death Sentence, only because it's not dodge and requires a slower playstyle. Trust me, if you learn about certain game mechanics and have enough patience, this is one of the very best decks you can use. It only has one weakness, and it's endless assaults on some of the maps. It's very often compared to Anarchist because they share one of the cards that gives invincibility, but they're not really in the same category. However, if you were to ask me or some other good players which perk deck is better, then Armor would be at least equal. Majority of the community would disagree, but it's the same story as with Crew Chief or Muscle. People are just too used to dodge or faster playstyles. Armor is all about patience, but if you have it, then you can do stuff like this. Unfortunately, as I just said, slower playstyle is a big problem, so all of the power Armor has is nearly irrelevant for newer players, which leaves it in only a slightly better position than Crew Chief or Muscle. Although good Armor is something else, and it's only fair for it to go all the way up to the S tier. The community favorite, and to some degree I can understand it. Rogue is one of the most straightforward things in this game that can play the game for you if luck is by your side. It's very good if you want to just YOLO and hope for the best instead of learning how the game works. The tiers are completely switched compared to Armor. For beginners, it's an S tier deck. For higher level of play, not so much. It's a high B. Of course that doesn't mean the deck is worse the better you are. It's just that Rogue will work better for you than most decks if you are new, and lots of other decks will work better for you once you get better. It's not a bad deck by any means either way. It's a rather forgotten deck by most people, and I can see why. It's nothing special other than its specific two-shot setup with HBV. There's just one problem with it, and it's the price you have to pay in order to even get it. Obviously, two-shot armor with a bit of dodge and speed is pretty good, although it's certainly not a deck I would recommend to a new player. It's more fragile than the previous decks I mentioned, and doesn't necessarily always allow for fast playstyle. On top of that, it's best played with Frenzy, which means you won't be able to tank half shots. As a new player, you 100% want to stay away from this deck. D tier. Things change a bit once you learn how to move around the map and know your limits. Two-shot armor is always great, and the combination of extra speed with dodge is not that bad either. Some people argue it's a better deck than Rogue. Personally, I disagree with it completely, simply because Crook is stupidly expensive to build for in the first place, and Rogue with first aid kits allows for a more aggressive playstyle or objective commitment. Regardless of that, I'm putting it in B tier for higher level of play, because it's definitely not a bad deck. I just don't think it's as good as some other people think it is. Another forgotten deck, not really surprising. There are two good things about it. It cannot be armor suppressed and regens very fast. Armor suppression is a very annoying mechanic in this game, but you can play around it most of the time. The armor regen is nice, but nothing outstanding. There's also this buff to akimbo weapons, but it's pretty irrelevant considering how much ammo akimbo weapons have, or how they can be built even if they do not. For beginners, it might be even worse than Crook, because it doesn't have any dodge and is best played with ICTV. D tier. I am not a fan of this deck at all, only putting it in low B because of how easily you can farm drama for longer fates. I think it's a bad deck other than that because armor suppression, while being very annoying at times, can only really be game ending in solo rounds. Good for stealth, not so much for loud. It's just very situational with its lockpicking and the lower targeting bonus. It's C tier for beginners because it has some dodge, and maybe the lower targeting could help from time to time. I don't really notice anything special about it though. More importantly, it's best played with health, so you can just go fags and you'll certainly have a better time than with Crook or Hitman. It's also C tier for the other side, because as a more experienced player you should know when to lockpick stuff, and you can also just bring a saw or something. I'm not sure if this deck was made with stealth in mind, because why would you need dodge there, but it's a pointless deck for loud gameplay nonetheless. I think Infiltrator is slightly underrated. You can build pretty tanky setups with it, and more importantly, dozers aren't really dozers against this deck. With enough patience, there's not that much enemies can do against you, even more so if you have first aid kits with ICTV. You can safely camp waiting for the right moment to move, and if a dozer rushes you, all you really need is your melee. For beginners, it ends up in the same tier as CC or Muscle, but for the other side, I'm giving it a B. And here we have the king of underrated decks. If there is one deck that does not get enough love, then it's Sociopath. Very good armor gating? You got it. Very tanky with multiple ways to build it? You got it. Crazy melee bonus? You got it. And the right panic mechanic? You got it. And you even get a bit of healing. This deck has so much stuff, and despite it, people are sleeping on it. I remember when I was very new to the game, I had not the worst time with this deck, so I'm giving it a C+ for the left side and a very solid A+ for the advanced one. Gambler is one of those perk decks that try to be good at multiple things at once, but then turn out to be mediocre at all of them. I don't really know what to say about it. It's a health-based deck, so it's certainly better than some of the other perks for newer players, but it's never really good. I am putting it in C tier for both levels of gameplay. The only reason why it's not in D tier on the right side is because it kinda supports the team to some degree. Very fragile, but it's currently one of my favorite decks in the game for one reason: the point freedom. Since it doesn't work with heavy armor, you are forced to either do TPS or LBV. The deck also doesn't need hostage taker at all, and jokers are optional. This leaves you with a lot of points, and it's the main reason why I like this deck so much. People usually complain that the health regen is not good enough. That's not true. It is not the health regen that is too bad, but the number of health points on its own. Not only are you forced to wear light armor, but don't have too much health either. One heavy unit can be a huge threat. In fact, almost every unit can. Despite being a health-based deck, this one gets a D from me on the left side, because you cannot go for tanky setups with it, and there's no dodge to help you recover from your mistakes. For the right side, I'm going with B-, because while having such health regeneration is great, being so fragile with no real defensive benefits is not. On stuff like dodge decks, you can just go with first aid kits and rush things. With Grinder, even this isn't always guaranteed. Objectively, worst deck in the game for loud gameplay, although personally I'd still pick it over Gambler. Yakuza was made entirely with stealth in mind, so not surprising. D on both sides. In my opinion, one of the most fun decks in the game, although very confusing for a lot of people. I wasn't really sure where to put it on the left side since it has some dodge, it's health based and the armor regen is very fast. But newer players do not know how to effectively kill enemies, and because of it they won't be able to get too much from the deck, so I'm keeping it in C tier. For the other side I think B+ is fine. It's a good deck, but I don't think I can put it on the same tier as decks like Crew Chief or Muscle, because it's also pretty fragile at times. I've played it quite a bit after the fix, but I don't think I noticed anything outstanding. I know for sure it's a terrible deck for the left side, because you have to keep dealing damage all the time to keep your stacks up. I know it cannot be high tier for the right side as well, simply because Crew Chief exists and it does the job much better. For beginners, I'm gonna put it in D tier, and C for the right side, assuming I've seen everything this deck has to offer. If there is something I am missing that will leave it in B tier, then feel free to tell me in the comments. Here we have one of the most popular decks in the game. If you're new, you can just grab Revenant skills with some DB shotgun, then force your way through everything and win with ease. The DPS you get with it is pretty nuts because it's best played with Suit, so it's pretty light on points. And there's no real reason for you to skip Berserker at the same time. Anarchist is an amazing tool for carrying games, although it's not as consistent as Armor, and Fade abusing is not as effective. Overall, it's an S tier deck for both sides nonetheless. The healing isn't that special, although the armor gating it has sometimes is nice. And that's the problem, sometimes. It's a very inconsistent deck and to some degree it's up to your team how it performs. I'm ranking it in C for both sides, because as a new player you should perform better with a health-based deck than stuff like Crook or Hitman, and as a more experienced one you'll probably be more successful with other decks. Unfortunately, it is not available anymore, so if you're about to buy the game, you won't be able to experience this deck. Unfortunately even more, it was one of the best decks in the game. Oh well, at least you have Leech now. I think everyone can agree that it's an S tier deck no matter how good or bad you are. 6 seconds of invincibility with cooldown that is never longer than 24 seconds is incredible. There is just one counter to it and I'm not a fan of it, the green dozers. While using the injector, most of the time you'll draw all the enemy aggro. Most because this game likes to be funny sometimes, and they only start targeting you after your injector is gone. And if there's a green dozer camping while you're trying to run from some place to another, you'll most likely die. I think it's a pretty dumb counter, but it doesn't change that much as it doesn't happen too often. In general, as a new player, you'll be allowed to make a lot of mistakes and leave because of how good this deck is. So I'm giving it a solid S for the left side. However, the deck is even crazier when used by people who know how to really push it to its limits. Constant injector from actively killing enemies, drawing aggro when need be, doing lots of objectives. This deck allows for so much, and so, here goes our first S+ rank in this tier list. I think more people are aware this deck exists after some of my old videos. In theory, you can just rush objectives with Swan Song and a Smoke Bomb without caring much. and I think it would be a good strategy for newer players, but I'm still getting complaints that people keep dying in the smoke bomb, which kinda lowers my placement for this deck. On top of that, the cooldown is pretty long, and I'm very well aware new players do not know how to kill enemies in this game, so let's say B tier for the left side is alright. Then we have the right one, and I'm giving it an A. I'm often almost as aggressive with this deck as I would be with Hacker, and I only ever die if I just don't care. The dodge is nuts in the smoke bomb, and if you combine it with deck knowledge plus first aid kits, I just cannot see this deck in B tier. I think everyone is well aware of what this deck is about. Crazy tankiness that allows to just keep rushing objectives without caring about stuff too much. No unit is dangerous to this deck, so there's no real way for you to be caught off guard, which means you are allowed to make at least 10 mistakes before something bad happens. Obviously this is an S+ tier deck whether you are new or not. Probably the second most underrated deck in the game. Some people seriously think it's the worst perk, and I just don't know how to respond to this. First of all, it's pretty tanky if built right. Another thing, the healing is very good. C tier is fair for the left side, because it's tankier compared to Zerg decks. Ranking it for the other side is a bit more complicated. The biggest issue with tag team is that for it to fully shine, you need to tag someone who is decent enough as well. This way, you can chain the gas dispenser and heal for the entire assault, but the problem is that no matter how good you are on your own, you just need to tag someone. And jokers are very random at this. The deck is capable of reaching A tier, but just because of the limits it can have, I am leaving it with B+. Easily the best dodge deck in the game, and one of the best overall at the same time. For some reason, some people still think Rogue is better, but I don't even want to argue about this. Hacker has higher dodge, crazy healing, and a very effective stun mechanic. Rogue is better for careless rushing if you're a new player, but Hacker is simply the best for those who know enough about the map and how to effectively kill enemies. For beginners, S-, because as we already know, killing enemies is a problem, and this deck rewards it the most. For the other side, it's a stupidly overpowered deck. Get a DPS build and you will never have to use cover again. S+ hands down. Here goes our recent addition to the game. Personally, I haven't had the chance to experience how good this deck really is, because it can be fully utilized without dying. I ran it like 5 times, maybe, and I didn't manage to die a single time, so you get the idea. I've seen some people run it in my lobbies though, and I have to say that having the Revenant skill tree built into a perk deck is pretty crazy. On top of that, you do not have to worry about stuff like armor suppression or grace period for the most part. Some people argue that it's not that good or Stoic is a better perk deck, but I will leave this up to you. For me, this deck gets a very easy S+ for both tiers. Alright, that's all of the decks ranked. Hopefully you had fun or learned something new. Remember that you don't have to agree with what I said and are free to share your own opinion in the comments.